You show up every day for your clients, offering empathy, patience, and support. But what happens when the weight of caring becomes too heavy to carry? In today's episode, we're uncovering the hidden cost of compassion, why so many BCBAs are silently struggling with compassion fatigue, how it different how it differs from burnout, and what you can do starting today to protect your passion and your own mental health. Welcome to Action Insights, the intersection between ABA and mental health. My name is Nikki Dione, and this is my colleague and friend.
Amelia Dalphonse.
And our episode today is called Burn Bright, Not Out, Recognizing and Reversing Compassion Fatigue in ABA. We are offering zero point 0.5 CEUs for this episode. There will be three code words throughout our podcast, so pay attention and write them down. Or if you're driving, use those good executive functioning to write it down later when you're not driving. So we'll have three code words. You do need to remember those. Then you can click on the link in the description to buy the CEUs for just $5. You'll get a little quiz which will ask you to enter the code words, and then you'll get your certificate after that. And our first code word today is natural. So our first code word is natural. So we're going to be talking about something that Amy and I talk about a lot and do a lot of training and teaching and thinking about, and that is compassion fatigue. And so, kind of our first place I sometimes like to start is having like a personal reflection or, to have everybody start thinking. But my question for you is, have you ever felt so emotionally drained after supporting clients that you start to question your own ability to help? So we're going to start talking about those experiences. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what compassion fatigue is and what burnout is. We're not going to spend a ton of time talking about burnout today because we are going to do, it gets its very own podcast episode because they are very different experiences. Sometimes people use the terms interchangeably, but today we're talking about compassion fatigue. So, compassion fatigue is the emotional residue or strain of exposure to working with those suffering from the consequences of traumatic events. So, you may have heard it called secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, right? We have all of these words. But what happens is that we are in a helping field because we have the desire to alleviate or help others who may be experiencing suffering due to things happening in life. Most often, trauma, and traumatic events and exposure kind of come into that. The important thing that I always like to say is that compassion fatigue is a natural response to having empathy for others and being exposed in an ongoing manner to their challenges and struggles. So it is common when supporting autistic individuals or others who face systemic barriers. So we're going to probably specifically focus around work with autistic individuals in today's podcast. I am an ABA provider or BCBA, and I'm also a mental health clinician. So I'm not only working with autistic individuals, but for today we'll focus probably primarily on that work and that it's common for behavior analysts to internalize some of that emotional strain, especially when we feel like things are not shifting or we're missing something or we have a lot of people that we're supporting who may be struggling. The difference from burnout. So, burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by prolonged and excessive stress. So, it has three parts to it, which is emotional exhaustion, depersonalization. So, we start to feel more detached from our clients or our work in general. And then we start to feel less, like less progress or success or accomplishment in our job. So burnout can happen in any profession, not just helping roles, whereas compassion fatigue is most common in roles where we are providing help or support to others. And that's why we're kind of talking about the difference. So compassion fatigue is more trauma exposure driven. Burnout is chronic workplace stress driven. Compassion fatigue can happen suddenly. Burnout usually happens over time or gradually. Compassion fatigue often includes feelings of guilt or helplessness about the inability or what we feel is the inability to alleviate the suffering others. There are some overlaps. So many BCBAs can have experienced both at the same time, both compassion fatigue and burnout. And if compassion fatigue is left unmanaged, so we have like really kind of long, prolonged compassion fatigue, that can lead to burnout. So that's why we just kind of, I just wanted to frame the difference a little bit, and we're going to focus on compassion fatigue specifically today.
I often think of one of the differences where burnout, compassion fatigue often happens because of our values, because we are so strong in our values and wanting to help. And I feel like burnout a lot of the times, one of the ways that I differentiate it is because of a misalignment with my values. So generally, a lot of times burnout will happen because all of the things that are happening in your job that's creating stress, it's creating stress because it doesn't align with your values. And so that for me is a big distinction is compassion fatigue is all about your values, and burnout is when there's a misalignment with your values.
Yeah. Thanks, Amy. Yeah. And I Amy and I always chat before we start recording. Some of our stuff's really hilarious. We should just record everything that we
We'll do
talk
we'll
about.
do an
But
outtakes reel at some
yeah.
point.
Or we at least think it's hilarious. But thinking about, as soon as she and I start talking about compassion fatigue, we're both like, oh, I have so many times where I can think back where I've experienced compassion fatigue. And we both have, provided supervision, and we both probably can think back and to like supporting staff who were in the midst of experiencing compassion fatigue. And then I can also think of times where I was experiencing compassion fatigue, my staff are experiencing compassion fatigue for our own reasons. And then like, it's kind of happening at the same time, and like how challenging that can be sometimes.
Right. It's definitely such a huge issue in our field because we're dealing with families who are experiencing so many different types of stressors. And it might be financial stress, it might be um, uh, relationship stress between parents, or it might be the parents' trauma response to their child's behavior, you know. So I was working with a family who the 9-year old, I had worked with him for several years, but as he got bigger and stronger, his aggression it was all directed at his stepmother. And she literally experienced trauma being in the house with him. She loved him, but his constant aggression towards her was very traumatic for her. And so then my role is to support her along with trying to reduce the challenging behavior, reduce that aggression. But it takes a toll on you as a provider to be put in that situation where you're using the skills that you have to try and make a difference, but sometimes the best you can do isn't enough.
Yeah. And I think that and two things leads us to our second code word, which is exhaustion. So our second code word is exhaustion. And as you're talking, Amy, I'm just thinking it literally just runs in, right? So that's one client, right? So Amy's working with one client. There's some exhaustion and you're supporting, and we know that sometimes things take a long time, but we're also when we walk into a space where there's a lot of stress that the family is experiencing, it's hard not to start to kind of feel or to take on some of that stress, especially when we don't walk in and say, it's like the Staples easy button, right? Do this thing, and you hit the easy button and it's just better. We know that sometimes change and learning skills takes a long time. Um, and so, but now imagine that you have 5, 6, 7, cases that you're working on that all have stress and significant needs. There may be traumatic events happening in real time or a history of trauma. And we're going from, house to house to house, or, client to client to client, or doing, 4 parent training sessions in a day, and like thinking about how sometimes like that can cause some exhaustion, especially when we know that we're in it for, kind of a longer period of time.
And we're supporting our staff in those situations as well. One
Right.
of the things that I've found, because I've done both, well, I've done community-based, school, clinic-based, and home-based work. And one of the things that I found was that the compassion fatigue is significantly higher when you're doing home-based work
Mhm.
because you're in the family's environment and you're seeing firsthand the challenges that that family is experiencing. It's one thing. So that family that I was talking about, when I first started working with them, I was seeing them in the clinic. And then, for a variety of reasons, if you followed my stories, you'll understand that I shifted to a role as an independent contractor and I started providing home based services to the same family. And the difference is really surprising in my response to the family. I felt the compassion for sure. I understood the challenges that this family was undergoing, but being in their space was a whole nother level. And it does wear you out very,
Yeah.
very quickly. And this certainly wasn't the only challenging case that I had at that moment. One of the things that I've had in my career is I tend to accept the cases that no one else wants. So I tend to take the Medicaid kids, the families who are really struggling, those really hard kids, those tend to be my cases. And it does really create a situation where I'm experiencing compassion fatigue and I'm on the fast track to burnout.
Right. Yeah. I I was thinking as you were talking too that um I wonder, and maybe you have a different thought about this, but so I don't have clinic-based experience. I have office, community, and home, right? So like not clinic where like, oh, and school. So like, I almost think too, like the amount of support that I have in any given moment. So if I go into a home, sometimes it's just me or me and an RBT, right, with the family. If I'm in a clinic, even if I'm working with an identified like student or client, like in a school or clinic, like sometimes like I have other adults around me, right? So just the presence of another, professional body that can like I can tap out or go to the bathroom if I need to, or like if there's a crisis, I have some backup. Like sometimes I wonder too, like how much that can contribute to because when I've been by myself in a community, it's just me that I rely on, right? But when I have somebody else, I'm like, okay, like now I have some shared experience or some shared support that, it still can cause fatigue and stress, but there's like, I don't know, for me, there's a little bit of a difference.
There's definitely a huge difference in the amount of support that you get when you're in an environment with other adults. Um, but also the stories that parents tend to tell are
Mhm.
you're getting different stories. And a lot of times it's the stories that
Right.
draw out that compassion and really weigh on you. And so I it's interesting and think we need a balance between the two kinds of experiences because I was able to help this family on a much different level when I was
Mhm.
providing services in the home. I was able to understand their challenges on a much different level, but I couldn't sustain it for as long as I could in a clinic. I was with them for another 2 years and then they lost insurance and I opted not to resume services with that family because um, and, and they're with another BCBA who I know and actually did a lot of training with. So I feel comfortable with the fact that they're in good hands. But I didn't feel like I could put myself back into that situation and still maintain my my career path because I was really on the, like I said, on the fast track to burnout because of all of the challenges that you just take on when you're in that situation. So um, I think there's value in home based work, but I don't know that it makes for a sustainable career when you're dealing with these families who are really suffering.
Yeah. And I think it I appreciate you sharing that. I think this is where like self-reflective practice, especially with compassion fatigue, right? Too, checking in with ourselves, like, can I keep going? If I take this case on again, is that going to be the best decision for me and for this family, right? Because if we take something on and we know that we can't sustain, and I know that this could get in a whole conversation about systemic stuff and what jobs let us do and all the things, but foundationally, if I know that something is contributing to significant stress or I can't sustain it, that will cause compassion fatigue and can lead to burnout, right? The other piece I was thinking is the home-based piece. You're getting more, you said I can get more of their story. And so that makes me think of complex trauma, right? So we might be hearing more or getting more information about the complex trauma history that our clients and families are experiencing in real time, especially if there's significant, harm happening in the home. I remember working with a family where there wasn't a lot of aggression at home, but they were sending their child into a school system where the child was experiencing trauma based off of like the system itself, right? Like they were and we're not talking like diagnosis, we're just talking about trauma exposure, right? Where the child felt unsafe because of the interactions they were perceiving to have. And so there was all of this trauma that was happening in school. This was also a child who was adopted, but adopted later. So we know there's a trauma history that occurred for this child before they were adopted into the family. And so really starting to think about when there's complex trauma, sometimes when the trauma is related to systems, right? Like, and I know that I can't just go in and be like, stop doing this thing, and everyone's going to go like, oh, of course, and then they stop doing it. That complex trauma piece and the exposure that we have can really start to impact our level of compassion fatigue and stress that we're feeling.
So I think
And
it's
so
important that we think about what are the things that we can do because it feels very heavy
I
when
know.
we're talking about it. And I think that we need to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. And goes beyond, take a bubble bath and practice a little bit of self-care. Like what are the things that we actually can do to make the situation better?
I was gonna say we share a brain because I literally was just gonna say this is all so sad and heavy and like doesn't feel, but compassion fatigue, there's like this foundational statement, like it happens. It is normal for people in helping professions to experience compassion fatigue. I don't know how many of us are talking about it. Like when I was a new clinician or, nobody was like, welcome to the field. Here's your onboarding booklet. Here's how you do therapy. Oh, and by the way, this is a possible side effect of what you're doing, and here's how you can proactively manage it, right? Could you imagine like how life might have looked like if that conversation had happened instead of me going, 2 years into being a therapist, working, and when I was a new therapist, I worked with only trauma cases. I had a caseload at one point of 50 kids in therapy, and like, which is a conversation for a different time because that's not okay. And they all had trauma, and probably a third of them had complex, severe, significant trauma. 2 years in, I'm like, what am I even doing? I don't even know. Like, am I functioning? Did I brush my teeth this morning? Like, how did I even get to work? Like all these things are happening. So we respond to compassion fatigue reactively because no, we don't talk about it. So my first statement of like, how do we manage this? How do we prevent compassion fatigue is as a supervisor, especially when I have for any staff that I'm supervising, but especially like new staff that I'm getting, one thing that we do or that is helpful is how do I start to purposefully talk about compassion fatigue in the context of the jobs that I am doing and the staff that I'm supporting or doing, or even with colleagues and peers? Like, how do we start to normalize talking about compassion fatigue? We're telling you it's a normal experience. I think the statistics are high. Like in the 80s where people reported like, yep, I've experienced compassion fatigue, right?
The
Um,
study is 72% experience burnout. I don't know if there's a lot of research around compassion fatigue separate from burnout, but
so
at
not
least not in ABA.
Yeah, I was gonna say not in the field of ABA. So if anyone's interested, there's tons of stuff in compassion fatigue in the field of psychology and weirdly in the field of nursing. And the statistics go between like 60% up to 85% of people report compassion fatigue. So I know that that's a pretty big gap, but it's a lot. It's more than half. So, and the more newer research is trending higher. So what that tells us, regardless of it, is that there is research out there. I know not in the field of ABA. There is more information coming about like compassion fatigue and compassionate care, that word compassion, right? Now, like you can do some research in from like 2021 to now and more like 2023 to now. We're seeing publications around compassion fatigue a lot more, but it's not integrated in. So anyway, it's high, right? It's more than half.
Yeah,
I when I have new staff and I onboard new staff, I tell them what their expectations are about showing up and what their caseloads might look like and how I go support them with, interventions in their job and I supervise around stuff. And am I talking about compassion fatigue? If we know that more than half of people, probably higher than that, are experience compassion fatigue at least once in their helping career, how do we start to normalize those conversations? So that, like when I think about the ways that we start to decrease, manage, prevent compassion fatigue, talking about it is one important step in our work.
I agree. I think it would be great if in our onboarding process, we talked about it, but then also offered them some strategies um, that they could use proactively when they're dealing with challenging families and challenging situations. I mean, the family themselves they're not necessarily challenging. They're just experiencing some challenges.
Mhm.
Sometimes the family is challenging, but that's not necessary for compassion fatigue to set in. Um, what strategies can we give our staff to manage at intake or at onboarding to help them manage those situations. And some of it is going to come to you because
Mhm.
you need to be open and available to having those conversations with your staff. So you need to make sure that you have the resources to manage that because that's going to contribute to your compassion fatigue because this is all part of the process. How do you show up for your staff and be able to support them if you're not managing your compassion fatigue yourself?
Right. Yeah, so I think one big piece of that, and Amy knows, and if anyone has like listened to me or trainings or any of those things, I think that self-awareness and the practice of reflection in our work is very important. And that will help us start to recognize early signs of compassion fatigue, right? Am I a little more irritable? Do I feel a little more detached? Am I not sleeping as well, right? Do I feel increased stress when I'm going to work? Do I notice that I'm showing up to team meetings a little bit late, right? Like kind of thinking about our private events, but also maybe some of these public events that other people might start to notice too. But if I'm engaging in reflection, if I'm really thinking about and talking with my supervisor or my consultation people or peers about the experiences I'm having, I'm more self-aware. I'm going to catch it sooner. When I believe we know, like our proactive strategies have much more effective long-term impact because they keep us in a place where we can access information and shift behavior and learn new skills than if we're reactive. If I'm already like really, really struggling with compassion fatigue and everything's reactive, it feels harder. We can still get back on like solid ground, but it feels harder to move. So, what am I engaging in for self-reflective practice? How am I aware or noticing what my specific shifts might be that indicate compassion fatigue is, kind of hanging out there a little bit, waiting.
And I think because a lot of staff, at least the staff that I've worked with, some of them come in with some of those self-reflective skills, but most of them we're working with individuals who are in school. Maybe they're pursuing their BCBA certification, but they're not in the stage of life where they're doing a whole lot of self-reflection.
Mhm.
And so, how do we kind of help guide them towards a place where they're doing some of this, where they have some self advocacy skills as well? Because a lot of them aren't willing or don't have the skills to say, no, I really can't take this case. This case is too hard for me right now, because they don't want to seem like a failure. And one of the tools that I really like is the ACT matrix for this because it's a really for me, it helps because I like it because it's super concrete and it helps my staff see that this is just a process that we're going through and it's a way of engaging in self-reflection that to me doesn't feel as fluffy as maybe some reflection reflective practices. Nikki and I are a little bit opposite on this. But I like to feel like I'm making progress, like I'm doing something that's going to have an impact. And for me, going through the ACT matrix, for me, by myself, but also teaching my staff how to use it just as a tool for checking in with myself or checking in with our team together. We could do a shared ACT matrix and seeing if we're all on the right path. And I know this can be really tricky, especially in the field as it is right now, because what we're looking at is understaffing, massive understaffing. And so we're looking to fill those spots. We want to get these RBTs on board as quickly as possible. And we're not necessarily thinking about are they in a place in their career or is their caseload balanced enough to manage the stress that this family is under.
Right.
We're not, I don't know that we have ever considered family stress as one of the factors of deciding on caseload allocation. Sometimes we look at the severity of the behaviors and some of the needs of the clients, but I don't know that we ever look at how much is this family struggling emotionally and how much trauma has this family experienced and comparing it across the different clients that we're dishing out to our staff.
Right. Yeah, and I think Amy and I always go back and forth about this self-reflection in general. And I like the ACT matrix. I do a lot of ACT stuff with my clients and in supervision. And maybe it's integrating for style about pulling in understanding my own trauma history. If most people report traumatic exposure in some context in their life. And just so do I understand my own trauma history? Do I understand my own strengths and areas that I'm still building? What is it like for me to set boundaries with somebody else? So, Amy and I have talked about this before, where I became a BCBA later in my career. I was a therapist for almost 15, 16 years before I became a BCBA. So when I've had supervision that differed from my values, I would be like, I'm not doing that. But then I think about me as a brand new staff coming out of school to a supervisor. There was no way I was saying no, right? Like it was so hard for me. And that becomes the responsibility of my supervisor to help me understand what my boundaries are and look at that, right? So not everybody can say no. Not everybody feels comfortable saying no to somebody who's their boss, right? So really thinking about how we're pulling all of these pieces in. Um, can be helpful. But I will give this one to you, Amy. I do love the ACT matrix because it allows for us to really think about things concretely and identify ways to manage it. So it's good that I understand my trauma history, but if I don't have a way to thoughtfully manage it in my professional life, right, then I just am aware of it. So it has to be both. Like I have to have this awareness and reflection about what I bring to the table and the problem solving and the specific skills of how I'm going to manage it. What resources do I need? Do I have the right or enough support, right? Like thinking about those things about how to manage, it has to integrate into both, um, which I think is just kind of important to think about.
I agree. Um,
And I think Amy and I could probably, I say this every time. I should just
every
stop
every
saying it.
episode.
We could talk for hours, but I also recognize that your time is valuable. We will continue to talk about compassion fatigue. I also joke a lot that any word that starts with self and a hyphen, self-awareness, self-efficacy, self-confidence, self-compassion, like we don't do a great job in the soft skills sometimes. Some people do, but like I didn't come out of my master's program going, oh, I learned so much about soft skills. Like I feel like I have everything. I have all these hard skills that I need and I have soft skills. No, I learned my hard skills so I can go out and do the job I need to do ethically and effectively. And where we see these gaps, I think, around compassion fatigue, around setting boundaries and all these other things, usually if I boil it down, the word I'm looking for starts with self and a hyphen. And so how do we start to teach these soft skills? And this is important in regard to self-compassion. But I know that we're at the end, so I'm just going to say our third code word for today is superpower. Our third code word is superpower. And that is because caring deeply in the work that you do is your superpower, and learning to protect your compassion and protect yourselves in that context is what keeps it sustainable, right? It's what keeps that superpower continuing to be a superpower.
That's so true. Our next episode is going to be on supporting parents. So that will hopefully help you as you move on from this episode of compassion about compassion fatigue. And I'm so happy that you all joined us and listened to us again. And I look forward to chatting with you all again next episode.
Yeah. Thanks everyone and take care.